On top of that, for the floor, you know that there are the seed tube elements as well as the companion cells. What is key for you, other than knowing these parts, is to be able to identify the parts. Okay, we have some practice in CA 4.1. Other than identifying the parts, you also need to be able to identify patterns in the way that these vessels are arranged. Very broadly, there were like 4 different kinds of patterns you see in your textbook. You know that there are patterns, dichots and monocots have different patterns in the way their vessels are arranged. In the dicot stem and the root, also different. Monocot stem and root, you also find some differences. And it's your task to be able to identify not just the vessels, but also the patterns in the way they are arranged. That was what we've done so far. Just purely about the parts. Today we're going to talk about how it works. How the plants transport water, all the way from the roots, all the way to the top of its leaves. I heard that in primary school you learned one of the methods already. Starts with a T. Is that true? You all learned this before in primary school? Transpiration? Okay, don't remember. Primary school was a blur. 6 years of your life, pop, gone. Primary school doesn't exist anymore. Okay. So today we're going to look at how plants transport water. Let's skip section 1. Let's skip the appetizer. Jump straight to the main course. Now, first lesson together, when we talk about transport systems in plants and in humans, one of the key comparisons made is that in animals, we find that there's a pump, right? Animals come with a heart, but if you were to tear a carrot out of the root, you don't see anything beating. You slice a potato in half, it doesn't spew out plant blood. There's no heart. Yet, plants are able to transport fluids, sugars, foods, to different parts of its body. You ever wonder how a tree that's so tall is able to transport water from the roots all the way to the top? Okay, I've heard this, but I don't know if it's true or not. If you're a tree hugger, you go up to the tree and then you press your ears to the tree, right? Alright, you can hear the water even flowing upwards. Go and try later. Sometimes you cannot tell if I'm telling the truth or not, it's just messing with you, I want to see you hug the tree. Okay, but for real, this is what I heard. Then sometimes as the water is traveling up, because it's such a long column of water, sometimes the water column is snapped because of forces of gravity and then the full tension on top. Sometimes you may hear a snap. So sometimes as you're listening, you may hear a crackle like lightning when you press yourself against the tree. That's what I heard because the water column sometimes cannot stay together and then it may snap along the way. That's a good question. I think the forces that drive the water up will eventually, the water will eventually go up and then it will connect itself again, form a continuous column of water. So today we're going to look at how plants are able to transport water without any pump. Okay. For yourself, I just need you to know 3 methods. 3 ways plants transport water. You can find it inside your CA. We've broken it up into 3 sections so that you can have a look. Okay, then we spend a little bit of time on each section. But at the very bottom, you find that there's a table. This table is somewhere where you can write down notes. If you do not want to make use of this table, that's totally fine by me. You can copy paste this table, put it into your notes, and you can add on from there. Okay? So just think of this as a way for you to organize your notes. Okay, but 3 sections today we're going to look at. First, let's look at the most interesting one, of which I brought an activity that you can play with. Okay, first, capillary action. Okay, right now, I'm going to pass around some items that we can use to visualize capillary action. Okay, you can work in triplets or pairs. Everybody, grab a vial. It is a vial. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, each group you can grab one vial. Okay, next, I'm going to everybody grab a straw. Okay, not everybody, each group grab a straw. Straw. Okay, so by now you should have a straw and a vial. Okay, next, I'm going to pass to you something very fragile. So far every class has spoken one, let's not be the next one. Okay, these are what I call, it's not me, this one, the field calls a capillary tube. It looks like a piece of glass, but actually at the core of it, it's a very, very, very thin tube. It's very expensive to make, so don't drop it, that's all I ask. You have a groove at your table. Whenever not in use, can you put it there? Don't let it roll off. Okay, try it's pretty expensive, around $50 a piece, so you don't break it up. Okay, just one. Okay. Okay. Here. Hold on there. I don't know how it's made. How they managed to make this very thin tube through the glass. Okay, what you're holding is called capillary tube. Hey, last but not least, I'm going to transfer some fluids. Oh, okay, that sounds weird. I'm going to put some liquid that's colored into your vials. It's colored green for no, it's just colored. Okay, it's not chlorophyll. Okay, but what we're going to attempt to do now is to try and visualize what capillary action is. Do not drink it. Yes, it's water. I mean, can lah. Alright, okay, so everyone has you should have now a vial with green liquid. Purely so that you can visualize the movement of the water. And then you should have a straw as well as a capillary tube. Right now, I'm going to show you how plants are able to transport water, the first method. This method is called capillary action. The beauty of this process is that it requires no energy. Right? Plants are able to transport water through this method, zero energy. So it's what we say a passive process. Sometimes you may hear the word active. Active means that it requires energy. Yeah? So like active transport. But capillary action is a passive process. Make makes use of the fundamentals that you've learned before in the first few chapters of biology. But we're going to visualize it right now. Okay? Here you have a straw, and in that straw, imagine that this straw is the xylem. Okay? So, this is where the magic begins. Take this straw, and then touch the tip of the green water. Watch as it rises up the straw. Okay, you may begin. Yeah. Imagine the straw is the xylem. Then you touch the water, and you will watch the water rise up the column. Hey, don't you suck, huh? Okay. Just let it touch the water. I'm not asking you to pull out your mouth and suck. Is it working? Are you supposed to squeeze it? No, just let it touch. Is it working? Hey, you have no skill. Is it working? Has anyone managed to observe the water rise up the column? Takes a little bit of belief and magic. Okay, your faith is weak. Okay, so anyone see anything yet? Okay, you see? Do you have anything? Am I fooling you all? No, I'm not fooling you all. Okay, look, this group worked. You see this small little tiny green? Yeah? You worked. I'm not kidding you. See, I never laughed you. Yeah, see? Water did rise up the column. I never say how much. Okay? Anyone? Have, right? A little bit of water went up the column. Okay. The beauty of this particular method of transport capillary action is that the thinner the tube, the higher the water column will rise. So that's why I provided you a capillary tube. Now take the glass capillary tube. We call it a capillary tube. Capillaries are tubes that are very, 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 very thin. This is the thinnest tube we can find in the lab. So right now, in your groups, you could take that thin capillary tube, let it touch the green water, observe what happens. You may even film it and add to your notes if you want to. Okay, I'm not scamming you this time, it's possible. Huh? Is it rising? Anyone's cube is working? And then you give you a new glass tube. No, that's not supposed to rise the whole way, by the way. It will just rise a little bit more. Oh, did yours rise a bit? Okay, if you imagine, if you're thinking it'll rise up all the way, that's not the truth. It should rise more than the straw. Really, nothing at all. Let's give you another tip. It could rise a bit more if we have a little bit more. I think there may be some water inside the tube. Yeah. Hey, are you letting it touch the base? Okay. Shouldn't. You try the other way? That's the thinnest tube I could find. Okay, just give me a bit. And sugar. Okay, here's a dude with many more tubes. Yeah, actually I brought one more set of tubes. Okay, this one is even more expensive. Okay, I did not use it with the other class because I thought you'll break it. Okay, you want to try? Okay, this tube is this one is even tougher to use. You see, it's so thin. Yeah, I think the tube itself isn't that thin. It's just the external walls are pretty thin. Okay, you can try, but be careful. You have to be very careful with this. It will snap in your hands. Okay, be very careful with this tube. This tube has not been used by a lot of classes. I mean, it just depends on how much a teacher trusts the class. You heard it? What? Really? Hey, then why I go and reuse and go and wash it? Waste my time. Ooh. Okay, there you go. So what do you use in chem for? Oh. Has everyone used this tube before? When do you use it? Chemistry lesson? Oh, yes. Yeah, later I'll blow into it. Sorry? Blow through it. No, please don't blow into it. Disgusting. Okay? Yeah. So what you just experienced in your hands, that's called capillary action. If you look in your textbook, this particular dude has a tube that's even thinner. Let's see. Okay, so this person has tubes of different diameters. Each one thinner than the next. So this one is the thinnest. Okay, that's how high it can go. Yeah. This one is the thickest, then thinner, then this one is the thinnest. It goes up so high. You just imagine xylem vessels, microscopic diameter. Right? The thinner it is, the higher the water column can climb. And that's one of the passive forces that drives the transport of water. Capillary action. Sorry?
Does it mean the taller the trees, the thinner the capillaries?
Then I'm not sure. Hey, that's a great question. Wow, that sounds quite logical also. That means perhaps the taller the plant, the thinner the xylem needs to be. I'm not very sure. Perhaps. In terms of weight, is it? Okay, so I would say it's hard to say how much. I think it's hard to measure how each one contributes to the transport of water. In reality, it's a combination of all three factors that drive the movement of water. It's hard to isolate either or. Oh. Right, I have no idea. It's a math thing. Yeah. I guess you have to calculate and observe for yourself what's the length that it climbs, right? You go and calculate whether more or less water is transported. If you look into your textbook, under when they talk about capillary action, okay, if you scroll down, okay, this section of the textbook describes a little bit about capillary action. Some words you may have seen before: cohesion, adhesion, surface tension. These three contribute to what you visibly observe as capillary action. I'd just like to share a little bit about what these three words mean. I do not expect you to memorize the definitions. You can use it in the vocabulary of your writing, but you do not need to describe these three words in detail. But let me just share what, if you were to use these words, what they mean. Number one, cohesion. Cohesion refers to the attraction of water molecules to themselves. Sorry, not to themselves, to each other. And guess what? It's actually related to what we've learned before. We learned in the first few chapters that water molecules are attracted to each other through hydrogen bonding. Okay? So that's the first force that keeps water together as a column, cohesion. Water molecules are inherently attracted to each other through their hydrogen bonding. Number two, next word you could talk about is adhesion. The water molecules inherently, they're also attracted to the sides of the walls of whatever the tube is. One may ask, therefore, what kind of forces are the water molecules using to cling to the sides of the walls? The best force, I think, is at play here are the ones that maybe you learn in chemistry. You learned before this induced dipole interaction, the one that's temporary. Yeah. So we don't quite use that term in biology, and that's why we didn't even describe the word over here of what kind of forces are at play. But if you really want to know, it's those kind of forces.
So it's just like water being attracted to other surfaces.
Yeah, it's just water being attracted to other surfaces. This is what adhesion is. You can adhere to something else. Whether you are cohesive or not is whether you are attracted to each other. The last force at play is surface tension. What's keeping the water at the surface clinging together? Also hydrogen bonding. That's what makes them sticky on the surface and not break apart so easily. Combination of these three allows the water columns to stay together and climb up the columns of the xylem. And the xylem vessels are extremely thin. I would say surface tension is like cohesion, just on the surface. So all these water molecules don't just fly away, they are clinging together on the surface because of the hydrogen bonding.
So it's like cohesion on the surface.
Yeah, it's like cohesion on the surface. That's what surface tension is. That's what keeps the water columns stuck to each other, and also what allows them to stick to the sides of the xylem and climb up the xylem. Water column up to minimize air water interface. Yeah, I'll get back to you. Thank you. Okay, that's force number one. But it's a passive force. Doesn't really require energy. But of course, this alone doesn't achieve the effect that we want to see of water going up the column. Let's go to the next process. Root pressure. Okay. Root pressure requires a little bit of energy. It is somewhat of an active process. We but to look at your CA, I have an experimental setup that we can use as an analogy of how root pressure works. Here in this diagram, you see a tube connected to a bag. And this bag is called visking tubing. Okay, it's just a bag that is made up of a material that is partially permeable. Some things can pass through, some things can't. And it says that inside this tube, there is sugar water. Okay, so sugar is inside. Outside, we have water. I'd like you now to make use of your concepts of osmosis. Would you expect water to go in to the visking tubing or out? Do you expect the water level here to dip or to rise? Okay, so you have to apply concepts that you already know. So on your CA, you could draw arrows to visualize the question. Is water going in or out? Is the water level going to dip or is it going to rise? Okay, so what's the direction of movement of water? Water goes inside, right? Okay, so water goes in. If water goes in, you expect this water level to rise. Why does water go in? Because the water potential outside is higher than the water potential on the inside. Yeah? Okay, this is the second way plants use to get water up the xylem. It does it in a very similar way. It makes use of the concept of osmosis and difference in water potential. The plant does it this way instead. This is the xylem, and here are the root cells. Okay, the diagram over here shows a root cell. What is not shown, which you can draw in, is the xylem vessel beside it. I've just drawn one more cell beside the xylem vessel, because in reality they're not directly touching each other, there are cells in between. Our plants do this instead. If you want to drive water up the xylem, one thing that the plants do is that it actively pumps sugars. Roots are actively always absorbing things like ions, solutes into itself. But one thing it does is to pump it into the xylem. Imagine now the xylem at the base is filled with lots of solutes. It kind of mirrors what we see over here. It kind of mirrors what we see in this experiment, where there is a high amount of solutes inside the bag over here. Imagine this to be the base of the xylem. So plants kind of do that. They load lots and lots of solutes. For example, more specifically things like mineral salts, like ions, because that's what xylem transports, not the sugars. Okay, so when I say solutes, things like ions, mineral salts. But what this does is that now with this low water potential here, it kind of draws a lot of water in also. So if there are neighboring cells beside the xylem or more root cells, now anything that contains water will be drawn into this region and it pushes all the water upwards. So if I think of it stepwise, number one would be to load it with lots of salts. Number two, following which lots of water will also follow suit and go in because of the low water potential inside. That's what root pressure is. So if you understand this experiment, our root hair cells and xylem are doing kind of the same thing. How does it what? Or how does the root hair cell tell ions apart from? But one way is that it can make use of all its membrane transport proteins to decide what to transport across. The last method you sort of learned in primary school. Last method. In the last method you've learned before in primary school, transpiration pool. It leverages on the idea that there's a lot of evaporation taking place at the leaves.
How do water and minerals get to the leaf?
Okay, this is the last method. But this last method is the most powerful method that helps to drive water up the plant.
How do water and minerals get to the leaves? Although roots can exert a slight upward pressure, it is evaporation of water from leaves, a process called transpiration, that moves water molecules and ions up from the roots. Transpiration exerts a pull that is relayed downward along a string of water molecules from leaf to root.
Yeah, that's it. Okay, again.
How do water and minerals get to the leaves? Although roots can exert a slight upward pressure, it is evaporation of water from leaves, a process called transpiration, that moves water molecules and ions up from the roots.
Okay? Really, transpiration is a simple process. There's evaporation taking place at the leaves. Every time water evaporates from the leaves, it pulls a little bit more water up the column. That's why we call this process a transpiration pull. Okay? Transpiration is the idea that things like water is evaporating from the leaves and it creates a suction force that pulls water up. This is the most powerful of all the forces. This force is also actually a passive force. There's no energy really being used. It relies on the power of the sun, causing water to evaporate from the leaves. What is more important therefore to you is, what could affect the rate of evaporation? If I want a plant to transpire, we want this transpiration pool to be stronger. What factors might I want to adjust to make it pull harder? For one, if it's really hot, okay, or rather we can play with temperature. Yeah, okay, I think this is probably related to physics. The temperature is really high, well, it will affect rates of evaporation. You can say it's wind. There's a lot of wind. It kind of affects humidity in the region. If the surrounding air, the humidity is very low, evaporation also will take place much faster. These three factors together affects the rate of this pull, this pulling effect. Okay, we'll take a pause here. If you're like to, you can go for a short break. We are struggling to stay awake already, myself included. Okay, if you want to, you go and wash up or drink some water, and then we'll continue in the last part. Yes. three methods? Okay, why can't I choose one? Which one should they therefore choose?
Capillary action, like the diameter of the tube,
Yeah.
then it wouldn't transport much, unless it be like a bunch. So like the one is kind of ineffective.
Okay, so perhaps you want to rely on which one?
Like the other two.
These two?
You send me a picture.
Okay. I find it hard to answer why. The best I could say is that it's evolution that led to this point. But I suspect that there are three different methods because conditions change. If, for example, we have an occasion where, if there's an occasion where the temperature is very low, then humidity is very high, relying on transpiration pool itself may not be that powerful. Perhaps now, therefore, we require an active process where we add salts and minerals to the xylem to pump water up. There may be a combination of these two may be just strong enough to get water up. So, perhaps my best reply to you would be each one of these methods have their limitations. They do have their strengths, but I think their strengths alone may not last them if conditions change. But together they make up for each other's limitations. Yes?
What happens if it's like the winter?
Winter. Oh, then will it freeze, is it?
Yeah, like does it die?
I don't know. I don't know if it will freeze. But I suspect, this winter time, a lot of trees, they just shed their leaves also.
Yeah.
So, I'm not very sure, but I suspect transpiration pool isn't even one of the factors that are very powerful at play.
So it's just those two.
Perhaps. But I think during winter time, a lot of the plants are just hibernating. I'm not very sure if there's a lot of active water being transported also.
With all the like extra food that they see.
But I think all the plants are going into hibernation mode. They have everything they need. They're just maintaining a low level of metabolism to keep it alive. Then when the sun, everything comes back, everything required to keep the processes moving, then they may resume a lot of the processes. Yeah. Oh, okay. Can you ask what's the difference between active and passive? When I say passive, I mean to say that the plant itself does not require to contribute any energy. Things like root pressure, the root cells actually needed some energy to put the ions and salts into the xylem in the first place, to get very salty, and then you draw water in to push it up. But these two processes, transpiration pool and capillary action, may rely not on additional energy, natural forces at play. Right, so we're going to close out the chapter. In the last part of how sugars are transported. If you're looking to discuss some of these answers here, we talked about some of them. For example, D, we've discussed how can the rate of process, let's start from the top. What is transpiration? Find it in your textbook. Little bit to do with evaporation from the leaves. B, what type of interaction allows for water to be pulled up the stem? Okay, although there is evaporation taking at the top, the forces of capillary action help keep that water together also. So you could include words like there's cohesion, there's adhesion. These forces still help to keep the water column together as water is moving up the stem. C, what process allows for movement of water out of the root cortex? What is the root cortex? What they are saying is, this is a root, okay, this is a root cell, and then this is the xylem. They're asking you what allows for water to move from the root to the xylem. Okay, and then you will just say osmosis. Okay, that's the main way water is being transported. Okay, then D, how can we increase the rate of transpiration? We talked about some earlier on, from temperature to humidity to wind.
If you ask for like type of interaction in part B, is it only the cohesion and adhesion?
Yes.
There's no surface tension.
Okay, surface tension, I would say it has surface tension when it is at the very, very top of the column.
Like it doesn't help to drive the water out.
It doesn't quite drive the water up. Not really.
Then
Yeah.
what-
So I think what they're asking here is what type of interaction allows for the water to be pulled up the xylem from the resulting tension? What allows the water to stay together so that it will move up as evaporation is taking place at the top? I think cohesion and adhesion are very important.
And how about surface tension? Like how does it come up with this whole picture? What is it?
Okay, that's a good point. Where does surface tension come in? Let me think. I think surface tension, if we do want to talk about it, it would be the very tip of the leaves. Okay, then therefore surface tension is not quite one of the things you would. Personally, I also have not used surface tension a lot when I describe the process of transpiration or what is pulling and holding the water up the column. Let me think. Okay, I cannot visualize how it's being used within the column itself either, even at the top of the leaves. So I think you can focus on cohesion and adhesion as the main forces that are clinging the water together, so it doesn't break apart. Yes?
Is there root pressure and transpiration pool like one big process?
Is root pressure and transpiration pool part of the same process? They are not. They could, technically it can happen, separate from each other, because if there's no evaporation taking place at the leaves, technically root pressure can still help to drive water up the plant. In a sense, the force is originating from different areas. In transpiration pool, the pulling effect starts from the leaves. In root pressure, it is pushing water up from the roots. So the effect of where the force is coming from is different. Root pressure is pushing from down up, transpiration pool is from pulling from up. So they can happen separately, but very often together. careful because a lot of cases of dengue rising. Some of our lab technicians, the elderly ones, they got dengue. So the labs have been very tight on staff these few days. Okay, we're down to the last part of the chapter. We scroll a little bit further down. We're going to go into transport of sugars. Okay, how do plants transport sugars within the phloem? In your notes, you can find the last part of the chapter. If you scroll all the way down, that's where you will find a very useful image for yourself. If you scroll down, transport of sugars. Sometimes we will use the word translocation. It means we are changing the location of the sugars from one place to another. Translocation. Okay? So this is the last part of the chapter. The paragraph that describes how sugars are transported is very short. I personally find the image at the last page more useful to help you understand how sugars are transported. And interestingly, phloems cannot quite serve their function if they don't work together with xylem. I used to think that phloem can function by itself to transport sugars. But actually, we require xylem beside it, then it can transport sugars, and we'll see how in a while. Okay, this video, you can find it inside your CA, so if you ever need something to visualize how sugars are transported, this will be a great video to watch. It shows you how the phloem and xylem works together to transport sugars through the phloem.
The vascular system of plants has two transport tissues called xylem and phloem. Xylem transports water and minerals, while phloem transports a variety of dissolved substances, including sugars and amino acids, throughout the plant. Water in the xylem always moves up in the direction from the roots to the leaves. At the leaves, water evaporates. This evaporation, called transpiration, creates tension at the top of the water column in the xylem and causes water to be drawn upward from the roots. Unlike in the xylem, the solution in the phloem can flow up or down the plant. The direction depends on the concentration of solutes in the phloem. A model called the pressure flow model describes how sucrose concentrations determine the direction of the flow. Two types of cells, source cells and sink cells, play roles in the transport of solutions in the phloem. Source cells produce sucrose and load it into the phloem. Source cells are typically photosynthetic leaf cells, but they can also be other cell types. For example, root cells with large stores of carbohydrates can act as source cells by releasing these carbohydrates into the phloem. Sink cells are any cells that unload sucrose from the phloem. Sink cells are found throughout the plant, but are abundant in roots or developing fruits and shoot tips. Sink cells typically cannot meet their own needs for carbohydrates and must import them from the phloem. The fluid begins to flow when source cells pump sucrose into the phloem. As the concentration of sucrose in the phloem increases, water enters the sieve tubes by osmosis. The water enters from any surrounding tissues, such as the xylem, that have lower solute concentrations than the phloem. As water flows into the sieve tubes, the turgor pressure within the sieve tubes increases. This pressure forces the sugar solution through the sieve tubes to regions of lower pressure. The solution passes by sink cells, and these cells take up sucrose. As the sucrose concentration decreases, water flows by osmosis out of the phloem to regions of higher solute concentrations. The loss of water, in turn, decreases the pressure in the phloem and pulls fluid from other, higher pressure regions of the phloem.
Okay, so that's how sugars are transported. I think the keywords you want to look out for are sources and sinks. These are two kinds of cells you can find throughout the plant. When we look at sources, sources are referring to all the leaves, the parts that produce sugars. Sinks are the parts that require sugars. So I'll give you some examples of sinks. Some examples of sinks would be things like your roots, perhaps a fruit that's developing. These are areas that we want to grab the sugars. So how do plants transport sugars? It's really a play of osmosis here. Sources are where lots of sugars are being made, and we learned before it's being made by the chloroplasts. So how can we transport sugars from here to here? Well, it does it through osmosis. Okay, not exactly, but you see how. As described in the video, number one, sources will help to pump sugars via active transport into the phloem. This active transport means that it requires energy. In your textbook, they may say the word loading. To load means to put something into something else. So that's what the sources are doing. They are loading sugars into the phloem. But that's not quite enough to get the sugars flowing from one area to another. The sugars are just stuck here. But this is where the xylem comes in. You know that xylem is filled with water, right? Yeah? Okay? So, xylem is filled with water. You expect that with lots of sugars here, it's almost like root pressure if you think about it, right? Except that now you can control the directionality. You expect that the water pressure, the water potential here is very low. There's a lot of water in the xylem vessels. Water can now move from the xylem into the phloem.